Shalom. This week we begin the second of the 5 books of Moses. In Hebrew that's called Shemot, or names, and in English we call that Exodus. When we begin, it's very important for us to know exactly where we're coming from, and of course also where we're going to. And in Hebrew, when we study Torah, it's very, very important to examine not only every word, but even every letter. It begins, as we read this coming Shabbat, Ve'ele Shemot Bnei Yisrael Habaim Mitzrayma. And these are the names of the sons of Israel who came into Egypt. The Torah portion did not have to begin that way. It could have said, Eile Shemot Bnei Yisrael. These are the names. However, it doesn't begin that way. It begins Ve. Eile Shemot, that Ve, the Vav in Hebrew, is and. And these are the names of the people that came into Egypt. And we can ask ourselves, why? I mean, the Torah is a document that we received from God above. Moses received this Torah directly from Hashem. So every letter and every word has a divine significance. If we want to understand very simply, the Vav, Ve'ele Shemot, and these are the names, comes to connect, to bond. Usually, if I begin a sentence and I say and I'm connecting two parts of the sentence. Here I'm also bonding, linking two things together. What am I linking together? We're linking together what we have just finished last week. In other words, last week when we seemingly concluded the first of the 5 books of Moses, Bereshit, in the beginning, Genesis, we didn't really conclude that. We're continuing with that. We're continuing with chapter 2 in the second of the 5 books of Moses. But it's actually a continuation. What is it a continuation of? It's a continuation of in the beginning. It's a continuation of, it's a continuation of creation. Here we're continuing with the story of the creation, and we will understand as we continue in the coming weeks exactly how that plays itself out. What are we talking about with creation? You know, when we read in the Passover Haggadah, the book that we read every Passover Eve as the holiday of Passover comes in, and we tell the story of the Exodus of the Jews, we begin with a very interesting question. It begins with the Jews. First we're talking about the disgrace of the Jewish people, and then we're coming into the glorification of the Jewish people. We're starting with them as slaves, and we're coming out with them as being free, liberated people, a free, liberated people. And of course, one can very, very easily and very rightfully ask, why do we begin that way? When I want to introduce somebody to a large group of people, I don't say, well, once this person did this thing wrong, and he did that thing wrong, and he was questioned by the police, and I begin with where he is today. And I would like to introduce you to the new director of our company, or I would like to introduce you to a new employee or whomever. And I want to show everybody how good that person is, and what he's done, and what he's accomplished, and what we expect him to do in the future. I show his positive side now. I don't go back 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and say that when he was a student in high school, he was caught doing such and such. When we begin the book of Exodus, when we begin right now in this week's Torah portion, coming off of last week when we had seen the greatness of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and we saw their sons, we saw Joseph and the brothers coming back together again, bonding back together again, then we think that now we are reaching tremendous heights. And what do we see happening this week? We see the Jewish people becoming enslaved in Egypt. We see their disgrace. We see what has happened to them. We see them not as a free people showing the light of God to the nations of the world. We see rather a people that seems to be feeble, a people that have no rights, a people that are being abandoned. We see orders being given by the king of Egypt, the Paro, to kill all the children, to kill all the male children. He's so scared of the Jewish people, then the people of Israel, Am Bnei Yisrael, that he even orders his own people, his Egyptian people, to kill any male born. And the question is, of course, why do we need all of this? I think that it's very important. We have to know where we're coming from, and of course we also have to know where we're going to. That's a theme that continues again and again and again throughout our history. And this is perhaps one of the points where that theme commences. Where are we coming from and where are we going to? Because when one understands where one came from, one can understand even how greater it is and how miraculous it is and how divine it is of where we have arrived at. And the same thing is true in the stories that we're going to see. In the Torah stories, they're not just stories, they come to teach us lessons. The Torah is not a history book. It doesn't come to give us names and dates so that somebody can ask on a test, when did this happen and who said this to that? The Torah comes to teach us, and we have to try to delve and see what that can teach us today. And I'd like to tell you two stories of two things that have happened that I think perhaps are examples of exactly what I'm talking about, where people came from and where they arrived at. And of course, what's more important. Here in Hebron, we have many different organizations that wander around, that are not very friendly towards us. There are international organizations, there are Israeli organizations, very left-wing. They call themselves human rights organizations. They're here to protect our poor, so-called Palestinian neighbors. And of course, they don't like us very much. A couple of weeks ago, I met outside a photographer, and we started to talk. I asked him who he was. He said he wanted to photograph within the community. I told him it would be preferable if he first sat and spoke with me. We made an appointment for later in the afternoon. A couple of hours later he came in, and he was with a woman, and they introduced themselves, and she told me that she was a researcher from Switzerland, and that she wanted some information about Hebron. I asked her what exactly she was looking for, and she said, I'm interested in knowing who lived in Hebron before the 1929 riots, before the massacre, before the expulsion. And I told her that I could help her if she wanted, but one of my colleagues was more of an expert in that particular field than I was. And if she'd like, I could introduce her to him, and she said yes. So I took her next door to my friend Noam Arnon and introduced them. And they made an appointment to meet a few days later. She came in and she sat down with Noam, and they spoke for a while. And it turns out that she was more interested in hearing about Hebron today, the community, where people came from, the kinds of problems we have here, the issues we have here. And after a couple of hours, she was actually wiping tears off of her cheeks. And she told Noam that actually she had come to Israel belonging to one of these very left-wing international organizations. And they were, of course, here to try to protect, so to speak, our neighbors. And as she was here longer and longer, she realized that it might be fruitful to speak with us also. And she suggested this to her colleagues, and they refused. They refused to speak to us or have anything to do with us. And she finally decided to take matters into her own hands. And she came and she heard the story of the Jewish community in Hebron from one of the people that lives here. And she, in the end, she was crying, and she said that somewhere in her family she has Jewish blood, and she knew that it was important to speak to the other side and to hear what they have to say. And she was just astounded. And a few days later, I met her at the Tomb of the Patriarchs at Me'arat HaMachpelah, and when she spoke to me, it was difficult for her to get the words out of her mouth. Her voice was choked. It was like somebody was holding her throat, and she was on the verge of tears. And she thanked me, and she said, "Thank you so much for meeting with me and introducing me to your friend, and it was so important." And I said, "You're leaving?" And she said, "Yes, unfortunately, I'd really like to stay." So, and it's an amazing story. Where did she come from? She came from an opinion that the Jews here were evil, and she left understanding that everything that she had heard about, everything that she had been told was simply not true, and that brought her to a very, very different emotional, and I believe also very different spiritual level. And this is with a woman who is not Jewish. And now I'd like to tell you another story about, it's similar with the beginning and the end. The last night of Hanukkah in Hebron, the last night we light 8 candles. And every night in the Tomb of the Patriarchs, there's a ceremony. And every night a different person or a group of people would come in and participate in that ceremony. The first night it was the Speaker of the Knesset. We had one of the police officers from Hebron. We had people from Kiryat Arba come down, and each night somebody else. The last night we brought in one of the military brigades that's been serving here in Hebron, and they discussed who was going to have the honor to light the candles, the 8 candles on the last night. And one of the officers, who is a company commander, he told his officer, "Look, you know something? I've never ever before been in the Tomb of the Patriarchs. This is my first time. And you know something? I never lit a Hanukkah menorah, and I'd like to do it." And in Israel, even people who aren't religious, they light the menorah. But this man had come from a non-religious family, and he said that he wanted to do this for the first time, and so he was given the honor. And not only did he light the menorah and say the 2 blessings, there's also a third blessing, which is a very special blessing, which we say at very happy occasions. And we also say the blessing on the first night of Hanukkah, having arrived at this occasion. We say, "Shechayanu v'kimanu v'giyanu l'zman hazeh," that God has kept us alive, and He's brought us to this very, very, very happy occasion. And this soldier said, this officer said, being that this is the first time in my life that I'm lighting a Hanukkah menorah, I want to say this very special blessing also. And so he did. So how do I look at this officer? Do I look at where he came from? The fact that he is now probably in his middle 20s, and he'd never yet lit a Hanukkah menorah, or to look at where he is today, bringing forth that light. This is the magic of Hebron. This is the magic of Marat Machpelah, of bringing people out of the darkness and into the light. That's the story of the Jewish people, from the darkness into the light. We're now coming into the beginning of that darkness, being slaves in Egypt. And over the next few weeks, we'll see how the Jewish people leave that darkness and come into the light. And that's a light that's eternal, that's lasted until this very day. And perhaps we'll even understand why it was necessary to start with the darkness, having to wait to come into the light. Thank you very much. Shalom.